We have Sylvester Turner, former mayor of Houston, chair emeritus of Climate Mayors, and Katjana Ballantyne, mayor of the city of Somerville. Our moderator tonight is Caleb Jackson Dresser, director of healthcare solutions at Change, and is assistant professor at the Harvard Medical School, and instructor and partner chair. With that, I will thank you for joining us, and I will pass it over to you.
Thanks for coming out tonight. Good to see you all. Some of you have probably traveled a long way. Thanks for being here. And thank you to both of you for coming and spending some time with us tonight to share your stories and your insights.
Thank you.
All weekend, we're going to be coming together here to talk about some of the issues at the intersection of climate change and its impacts on public health. There are a lot of topics in this space that are going to be covered this weekend. Tonight, we're going to start that conversation by learning from some of the folks who are leading efforts at the forefront of where a lot of the impacts happen and a lot of the solutions are happening, and that's city mayors. So we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts of climate change on cities. We're going to learn a little bit about what happens in a city to deal with those impacts. How do you build resilience? How do you maybe pair that with drawing down carbon emissions at the same time? And what can cities be doing together to be part of the solution here? I'm wondering if we can start with your motivations. You've both done great work in this space, and you each have different stories about how you came to this work. Considering the wide variety of challenges that each of your cities faced and will face in the future, what can you share about how you came to land on climate change and its impacts as something that you needed to engage with? What were you seeing? What are the stories? How did you get to this spot tonight? Mayor Turner, you want to start?
And number one, it's good to be with everybody this evening. And, you know, coming from the South, the hurricane just came through Florida, so very timely subject. I became mayor in 2016. And 4 months after being mayor, I faced a tax day flood, a 500-year storm. And I said, welcome to City Hall. And the next year was Hurricane Harvey, 2017. 52 inches of rain fell on the city. And then in 2019 was Tropical Storm Imelda, another 500-year storm. In all, in my 8 years as mayor, we faced 7 federally declared disasters. And so we knew something had to change. These storms were coming with greater frequency, greater intensity, and we just couldn't ignore the realities. And then I went to the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And they had just recently formed climate mayors. And Mayor Garcetti out of LA asked a couple of us to join him as vice chair. And I did. And that was at the time when the federal government and president was pulling away from the Paris Agreement. And mayors decided that subnational diplomacy was best. And so got engaged with the U.S. climate mayors. It was after Hurricane Harvey, when 52 inches of rain fell, that we decided in Houston, energy capital of the world, that we couldn't ignore what was taking place. And that's when we started to put together a Resilient Houston plan, a climate action plan, and then it just went from there.
Yeah, and a lot of good work has happened. And we're going to return to some of that work in a few minutes. Yeah. Mayor Ballantyne, your city is just a couple of miles from here. Some of us have lived there. And there's a lot going on in that community. What are your motivations? What are you seeing? What brings you to this conversation tonight?
So thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here. I think, you know, the motivation starts with me personally, sort of my personal story, the influences of my family. So at a very high level, I was born and orphaned in Greece. I was adopted there by my Scottish father, hence the name Ballantyne, and my Czech-German mother, Katjana, is Eastern European. Their migration story after World War, or during the war and after World War II, brought them to different countries in Europe. They landed in Greece. They couldn't have kids. They adopted my brother and then myself. And so we're a family of immigrants, and we immigrated to the United States when I was 4. I learned then that people are afraid of differences. I went on first and only one in my family to go to college. Worked in the private sector, nonprofit sector, and now government sector. My professional experience has taught me to value differences also, to believe in inclusive leadership. And so my vision for my city is an inclusive, equitable city where we can all thrive together. How that relates to the climate piece is we were of modest means. When I think about it, you know, growing up or when I spent summers with my grandmother in Europe, I had to recycle everything. So Europe still in the 70s didn't, you know, I had to separate the colored glass, make sure it was clean, bring it to the recycle place. I saw through the modest means, I guess, of my choice is the connection between the earth, you know, the environment and us. Spent a lot of time, you know, hiking up in the mountains on glaciers. And, you know, then fast forward 40 years and I'm bringing my 10-year-old to some of the places where I am at. And I see that the glaciers have dropped in height nearly 100 feet, you know, really seeing that connection. I moved to Somerville and, you know, my husband and I are very much we would say just living in a very dense city is saving energy, so to speak, is less of an impact on our climate. So we intentionally made the decision almost 17 years ago to not own a car. So we get around on public transit, we bike, we walk. I can do that in Somerville. I can do that if I'm working in Boston. I understand it. Once you leave, it's, you know, it's a lot harder. So there was this personal, I just did it. And I will say, when I first ran for political office in 2011, I mean, that wasn't that long ago. The progressives said to me, don't tell people you don't have a car. They're going to think you're weird, even though, and so anyways, you know, that was it. And I would say I was 8 years a city councilor. I've been mayor since January of 2022. I was the lead on anything that had to do with climate change, whether it was when we couldn't get the international building code moving fast enough. We were able to incentivize, you know, LEED Platinum certifiability with our zoning code, native species ordinance, you know, trying to put as many trees in as possible and trying to put it all together. And, you know, I can talk about other things that our city is doing later.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, we have an audience here that includes a number of experts in public health, people who are implementers, people who are working in government. I want to bring this back to you, Mayor Turner, and pick on a couple of those themes that just came up. One of those is the changing environment for doing this work socially, politically, from a governance standpoint. You've had a long career in public service. What is your vision now for a climate resilient city? And how has that evolved from what you've seen over the years?
Well, let me back up. When I first came into office, I came from a community in which I was born and reared and still live. A low-income, primarily African-American community, where many people were living already on the margins. And when these storms came in, they were in a constant state of need and recovery. And these events, climate was the intersection between economic disparities, health disparities, housing disparities. And so we put together what we call complete communities, where the focus was on communities that have been underserved and under-resourced for decades. In fact, Shannon Buggs, my director of complete communities, is here. And we wanted to concentrate on these communities that have been underserved. And then the storms kept coming. And so with complete communities, we put in place, put it in writing, became a part of the city's focus, priorities. And then it was important for complete communities to have equity. Because what I was finding is that you talk about climate change all you want to, but when people are dealing with health, economic, and housing disparities, climate change was more of an academic discussion rather than a real life discussion. And so you can't have climate change without equity being at the table, because the people who are adversely affected the most are the people where they have very limited resources. And so they're constantly dealing with what's happening in their lives on a regular basis. And so for me, when I came in as mayor, dealing with these different storms, what we found ourselves is that we were spending a lot of time in these communities who are on the margin. And every time one of these storms came along, it seemed like they were pushed down a little bit further.
Yep.
And a little bit further. And then it did affect their health. It did affect the limited resources that they had. And so when we put together the Resilient Houston Plan and the Climate Action Plan, we borrowed from my Complete Communities initiative a lot of community engagement, meeting with people in the neighborhoods, 18 months, and asking them, what do you need? What do you see the problems? Where have we failed you? And how can we assist you in transforming your lives? It was that same community engagement that we utilized when it came to the Resilient Houston Plan and the Climate Action Plan. But equity had to be at the table.
Couldn't agree more. I want to take this same theme of health equity, which is a huge issue that we are wrestling with within healthcare, from a public health standpoint, and throughout our society. Mayor Ballantyne, I work in one of the emergency departments less than a mile from here. I've cared for patients who couldn't afford air conditioning and wound up in my emergency department with heat-related illnesses. I've cared for patients dealing with physical displacement actually out of other parts of the United States into our community after some of these storms that have affected people. What's happening in Somerville? What are you thinking about as people face these threats? What can we do as a community to make sure that those who are most impacted are supported and that we're prioritizing their needs?
Thank you for the question. You know, similarly, I would just say, as I say to my staff, is equity can't be a buzzword. So it is part of, and sustainability, and making sure that we're really intentional on our climate efforts. It is a prerequisite. We have about 3,000 people working, you know, in the city of Somerville, and it's how do you move organization forward and get the information you work. I will say this, we started building forms and just saying, you have to, you know, say, how does this advance equity? How does this tie into our goals? How does this impact climate change? It's like, it's built into everything that is done that people have to stop and think. I'm not an expert in many of the fields, so my staff can bring their expertise and they see things, you know, on the ground that work. We have, you know, what are we doing in Somerville on the health piece of it? You know, simple things. It's like we have snowstorms, and when we have the snowstorms, my like first 7 days in as mayor, we had I think it was like 73 people on a Zoom call. And it was all the different departments that were impacted. And okay, we did that. And I'm just like, so what are we doing for the heat? You know, and it was just, it's not just the snowstorms, it is the heat. So we do the same things now as, you know, now we have, you know, a system in place, but what centers are open? Who is reaching out to our various cultural groups or immigrant groups? What's, you know, who doesn't have the Council on Aging, our senior, you know, centers. So we have, you know, developed this checklist to make sure as the weather changes and it impacts our daily lives, that we try to do as much as we can in, you know, as a government. I will say is we have two really bad heat sink areas in Somerville in our 4 square miles. And I have put a few $1 million into just getting street trees planted to make sure that those areas in the city, you know, have can be cooling. The other thing, when we have the rains, because, you know, this idea of a 100-year storm seems to be happening like every 7 or 8 years. We have flooding in Somerville. So our underground infrastructure, as we're upgrading our underground infrastructure, has green infrastructure. A brand new park in the heart of Union Square in Somerville has a 1.2 million gallon tank to, you know, take in all that flooding water. When I first became a city councilor back in 2014, I would get these heart-wrenching phone calls, people saying, my basement, my house is flooded, my business is flooded. And since that tank has been in now for almost 2 years, I get a few calls, not hundreds of calls. You know, there might be a little bit. So we're trying to integrate it in the built environment, the underground environment, the natural environment to make sure that we can cool things down, and then share all those resources if we have cool spaces, that it's open to the public.
Fantastic. I'd like to continue on the theme of urban green space a little bit. Mayor Turner, you've worked with mayors around the country on their climate plans for their cities. What have you heard about some of the real successes with green space, and maybe what are some of the challenges we also need to be thoughtful about when engaging on that?
Well, green spaces are critically important. I served as the board chair of the Global Resilient Cities Network. In Oslo, for example, they are noted for protecting their green space, preserving and protecting. In Paris, for example, they've taken their school grounds, yards, and turned them into land oasis. Beautiful. Removing a lot of the concrete, cement, stuff like that. That's working very well. In Rotterdam, for example, they are doing an excellent job in many of their public spaces where they are able to hold a lot of rainwater and again, preserving as much green space. In the city of Houston, I will tell you, we have placed even more emphasis on green space. Mayor spoke about green stormwater infrastructure, for example. Under the Resilient Houston Plan, Climate Action Plan, the goal was to implement 100 green stormwater projects by 2025. We are pretty much 88, 90% at that moment. A part of the Complete Communities Initiative was to expand parks. Houston has beautiful legacy signature parks. But what about the other 400 neighborhood parks? Yeah. And so we now, as a part of equity, we are focusing a lot more attention on those neighborhood parks. We did some heat mapping because in Houston, the heat can come and can stay around. And what we discovered in many of these communities that are vulnerable on the margin is where a lot of the heat islands are. So as a part of the Climate Action Plan, the goal was to plant 4.6 million trees by 2030. There are 2.3 million Houstonians in the city of Houston, 2 trees for every person. But you just don't plant them just to be planting them. You take a look at the data, your heat mapping, and then you plant them accordingly.
We make sure there's a community process for everything. If we're, we do have a climate forward plan, an action plan. We just unveiled our second one. We had 4 times as many people involved in that when we started it in 2022, which was wonderful. It is that people buy into it and they feel shared purpose, and then they rally. So then when it comes to the implementation, it's just easier to implement. There's not the natural tussles that happen maybe between the legislative and the executive, because the community has been so involved. And, you know, people in Somerville, I would say, because it's a value for them and that government has delivered to make sure that they have a voice in things, they come out and they participate. So I would say at this point, you know, it's part of our DNA. And, you know, if you try to go it alone, we were talking about it a little earlier, it doesn't work. You know, it's, you know, anybody who's worked in an organization and someone says, okay, this is the way it is. And you say, well, it would have been nice if I knew about it, or how are we going to implement it? And I think those tussles that happen without community engagement draws out the process longer. Even though the community engagement portion might be a year, it might be 3 years, depending on what it is. For the city of Somerville, for example, we have a strategic plan. We call it Summer Vision. So where do we want to see our city be in terms of its growth, its development, its open space, its connectivity to traffic, and how do we want to make it more walkable? That process or that strategic plan, that one takes a little bit longer. That's usually closer to the 3-year mark. But then people have rallied around it. They've bought into it and they have shared purpose.
Yeah. I want to continue on the theme of stakeholders. You spent 8 years leading the city of Houston through a series of weather calamities and storms, and also a lot of population growth, a lot of business growth. How did different stakeholders at that table wind up interacting around some of these impacts and some of the solutions?
Well, I would tell you, you know, there was a time when Houston mayors didn't speak openly about climate change, or, you know, we would talk about it, but we would be in another city or another state, you know, but not openly, you know, energy capital of the world. Then the storms kept coming. And we recognized, as I would say to some of the CEOs of our energy companies, many of your employees are living in my city. And we have to take care of them. So we have to get in, we all have to be in this together. And if we're not in it together, we lose. And some of the largest greenhouse gas emitters are right there in the city of Houston. And so we came to the conclusion that if we could help to achieve our goals and objectives in Houston, it could be done anywhere in the world. The Resilient Houston Plan, interestingly, was underwritten by Shell. The Climate Action Plan was underwritten by CenterPoint Utilities. My Evolve Houston Plan, electrifying 50% of the fleet by 2030, private and public, was in collaboration with NRG, Shell, CenterPoint, and University of Houston. We had a landfill in a low-income Black community that was put in place in the 1930s, closed under protest in 1970s, 240 contaminated acres. And that landfill has been holding down this community for the last 50 plus years. What we decided is to turn that into the largest solar field, urban, in the country. And we partnered with some of our energy companies, along with the community, to make that happen. And it is well underway. And it will remove about 120 million pounds of emissions out of the air, provide green jobs for many of the people in that community, well over $70 million investment, and we're moving forward. But that was done in collaboration. When I was asked to head the U.S. climate mayors, I went in and had a conversation with some of the CEOs of my energy companies. And I said, look, I'm vice chair now, seeking to hold it. Do you have any objections? You know, and what they said, you know, Mayor, this is an opportunity, maybe just to tell Houston's story. And so in part, we borrowed from Somerville, Greentown Labs in Somerville, and they expanded to the city of Houston.
Yes.
And the goal was to create 50 2.0 clean tech, climate tech companies before 2025. They are well ahead of their goal. About 70 have been created, and we've moved forward. The point that I'm making is that it does require everybody to be at the table. And so in the Climate Action Plan, it talks about energy transition. It talks about electrifying our vehicles, building optimization, and establishing a circular economy. All of these things and more are done in collaboration with the community, with our business sector, health providers, and others in order to make it happen.
I want to move to housing, but first I want to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on the Greentown Labs and other sort of components of this business community engagement, because that's outside what we often think about in public health. But from a leadership standpoint, anything you want to share from that perspective?
You know, we're just thrilled that they're there. I think it's just an extension of where the thoughts are and the ideas are, and that climate change is really important. When we attracted Greentown Labs, we actually got them from Boston, the Seaport District. So when they came here, and we have been fortunate that two of the companies that started in Greentown Labs, one is Form Energy, so they do battery storage and reverse rusting. And there's another portable battery company called Spark Charge. So they've expanded. They have hundreds of people here. They're also spreading themselves around the country too with other locations. So I think that what works for them is the workforce is here. You know, who lives in Somerville, who lives in the greater Boston area. So it's a good place for them to be. There's another company, Sublime. So they are doing concrete, but they are using significantly less energy than in the traditional concrete making. So where we can, we're still working on it. We're trying to, partner with them and also connect our youth to some of the really exciting and innovative things that are going on there, to try to have some internships or workshops going on there. I just would like to add that, Somerville also, we did our climate action plan. It's just like, where do we want to be? Where's the vision? And then we did a vulnerability assessment. So where are our issues? For the city of Somerville, we are a dormitory to Boston and Cambridge. 8 out of 10 cars on the road in Somerville are just passing through. They're trying to get to Boston and Cambridge to go to work. So my point has always been, how do I make it safer, but also give greener options for people to move around in Somerville? So if you ever drive through Somerville now, we like to slow things down, because speeding traffic is the #1 public safety concern and issue in our city. But we have expanded sidewalks, we have protected bike lanes, we have dedicated bus lanes. And that is, again, to get people to their places and give them green options, or the train now. We have the extension of the Green Line that opened a year and a half ago. So it's, how do you move around? Then where's our buildings? Interesting for Somerville, when I said we're the dormitory to Boston and Cambridge, we did not have a lot of office buildings. Davis Square had 3. One was a healthcare 4-story, another was an office building, and a bank and an office building 4 stories. It took 32 years to build the next office building, which happened in the Assembly Row area. And yes, we have 7 life science buildings that are in some form. 2 are tenanted, and the others are in a form of construction. So the buildings, we were able to capture, trying to make them as energy efficient as possible, but it's our housing stock. And the 2 and 3 families, that is the big push for us. And I'm just going to finish. One more thing is, you know, I just met with the utilities this morning. My first meeting in was, you know, we have all these, this goal and strategic plan. How are you going to make sure there's enough power here? Because we can't necessarily expand to the height and bring in the commercial we want around the existing Greentown labs. They have to move over like 500 yards because there's power there, but there's not power here. So, you know, we shared our long-term plan with them where we want to see the growth. Now they're trying to say, okay, this is our plan to get the power to Somerville so it can build, and also try to incentivize the residential to move away from gas to electric.
Yeah, lots to talk about here. I want to open this up to the audience for a few questions. If I can ask you to just briefly identify where in the world you're coming from today, and then ask your question. We have microphones on either side. And so you can either come up to the microphone or form a line there. And while that's getting started, I just want to ask you, as folks are lining up there, we've got a hurricane that's impacting the US today.
Oh.
You've seen a lot of storms. She was mentioning the process of vulnerability assessment, adaptation planning. Do you have some insights you want to share with the audience here on lessons learned from Hurricane Harvey and some of these other storms, and how that affected the resilience plan in Houston, and maybe what you're sharing with other mayors around the world?
Well, for me, point number one is that number one, each storm is different. Each storm has its own personality and character. Secondly, you don't build back, you build forward. For a long time, storms come, they could do damage, and cities were just rebuilding where they were. Another storm come, damage done, you're getting federal dollars and others, you rebuild. You do that, you build back for failure. So we build forward. There are times after Hurricane Harvey, for example, there were housing developments that were in the floodway or areas that we knew were prone to flood. We said, no, we're not going to let you build back there. Because in many of those, there were vulnerable individuals, families, and we were not going to put them in harm's way. So we said no. And then we changed our building codes where you had to build up, you had to build higher. We recognized that could affect affordability, so we had to come up with various incentives so that it wouldn't work against families who were at their margins, but you had to build higher. And then for many of these communities in the resilience plan, we said there needs to be resilient hubs. So in many of these communities, for example, we put in place resilient hubs. So example, if the power should go out, these hubs were right there in their communities that they could go to. And then resilience is not just about storm or weather events. Resilience comes in many forms. It could be housing, health, economic, all of those things. You have to strengthen those communities and strengthen those neighborhoods. If you strengthen them, then they can withstand or be in a better position to withstand when those storms should come. So those were lessons learned. But the major one for us is don't build back, build forward.
Build forward.
Right.
All right. Any questions from the audience? There's a lot to unpack here. Can we get a microphone over to her?
Hi, my name is Laura. I live right down the street. And actually, my question is for Mayor Turner. First of all, thank you both for your service as leaders. I want to ask about another aspect of climate and health, which is skin cancer. Skin cancer.
Skin cancer.
Texas is very high. I think the rates are like 1 out of 3 Texans have skin cancer because of the exposure to the sun, so forth. I wanted to inquire about your efforts, progressive efforts moving forward to decrease the incidence of skin cancer.
Well,
Thank
that's
you.
one of the things why we did this, for example, like the heat mapping. Because if you don't address that, people are limited by where they can live or their exposure. And then many of the people that we are talking about, for example, work outside, and they have to work outside. And so you have to address that. We're kind of in a tug of war with our legislature right now, because when there's a lot of heat, we're wanting these breaks to take place, and the legislature has not been receptive to that. But that's Texas for now, and I'll say that for another day. But that's a major problem, and that's why we're focusing quite a bit on planting these 4.6 million trees in this decade alone, but strategically placing them where they can be found. The other thing is that we're fortunate, for example, to have the medical center right there in the heart of our city. And we're working in collaboration with them, and they are working out in these various communities and neighborhoods. And I'm very appreciative of that. And not only skin cancer, but there have been other forms of cancer. In one of my zip codes, for example, the life expectancy is 20 years or less than the neighboring zip code. That doesn't make any sense. Houston's 4th largest city, highly prosperous city, but at the same time, and with the medical center there, but you have these elements that are taking place. So there are things that we're intentionally having to address, because that adds to the shocks and the stresses that people are facing. And if they don't have the access and the means to address that, then it just adds to their vulnerabilities. So all of that is a part of building a resilient ecosystem that we're addressing in the city of Houston. And that's something I'm very passionate. I was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago in my jaw area, but I had access to quality health care, okay? But there are many, many people within my own city that don't have the access that I have. So when it comes to healthcare, that's a passion of mine. My dad died of cancer, but my dad didn't have any private health insurance. So the only thing he had was a bottle of painkillers, and he worked until the night that he passed because he had 9 kids to feed, and he died early. Here I come, his son. I'm the mayor. I have access to quality health care, and I'm still here and right here in front of you all. So I appreciate the question, but very, very committed to doing everything that I can to make sure that people get the access to the quality health care and the environment, okay, that can bring these sort of things about. The quality of life is critically important. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yeah, let's use the microphone. Thank you.
So my name is Louis Casas. I'm a professor at Boston University and a graduate of the Harvard School of Public Health, where I received a doctorate in 1980, so some time ago. And I've just been made an emeritus professor at Boston University. I want to applaud the mayors for what I think is a terrific progress that they've made in terms of climate action, which is well, you say the role of government in climate action and how government can in fact be brought to bear in terms of the improvement of climate. I wanted to turn to another subject, which is gun control. And the fact that we live in a very violent society in our country, and some have characterized it as the Wild West, compared to the kind of controls that exist in other countries in Europe and elsewhere, where in fact gun violence has been reduced dramatically. How, in fact, have your cities implemented the kind of controls so that one feels comfortable in their environment and neighborhoods?
Well, I could certainly go on that one, but I'm from Texas. So now let me just say, my politics is not in alignment with the state politics. And even when we start to address it from the municipal perspective, the state legislature, the governing state legislature, preempted cities from taking any initiative. Okay, so that's a major, major problem. The gun violence is a public health crisis, but not in Texas, across the country. And more children are dying from gun violence than from anything else. In Texas, it's easier for me to go get a gun than it is for me to go vote. Okay.
Mm.
And I think that says it. That says it all. And you keep asking, when are we going to recognize that the course that we are on is not a good one? And again, and I'm going to continue to tie it into resilience, because those are the shocks and stresses that communities are facing every day. And in many of these communities, not only are they dealing with climate change and the effects of climate change, but the intersection with housing disparities, health disparities, economic disparities, and gun violence. And they're having to deal with all of this at one time. So even to be effective in dealing with climate change, to getting communities to understand the importance of climate change, you also have to speak to them on these issues as well. So I wish I had a better answer today. Quite honestly, I look forward to going to Congress and addressing that in January. Because I think if you ask many people, especially children, they're running more and more concerned about guns and coming to their schools or violence in their schools than they are about the learning that needs to take place there. And I don't think that, well, I was going to say something else, but that wouldn't be politically correct. So let me stop before I say something.
All right.
Mayor, I
Yeah.
yield.
So
Oh.
if I can, so I'm going to come at it from a different perspective in terms of who lives in Somerville. As of the 2020 census, 50% of our population is 35 and under. When I moved to and that's changed from 2000, that has, it was maybe about 7 or 8%. When I I just like anybody, they have their story. I had to work for the things that I got. My parents would have helped me if they could. And this idea of housing security and work security has always been something that the affordability, it's the ratio of jobs to housing. I get it. So I say to myself, if we have 5,000 students in our school district, we're a majority minority schools district. Over 62% identify as low income. I'm the mom of 2. My children have gone through, well, the older one graduated, the other one is in high school in the Somerville Public Schools. I know the children very well. I live next to a public housing project. I know the families, the kids. And so I say to myself, whatever time I have as mayor of Somerville, what I want to affect is all this change that we're seeing, that as the city is transforming, that if I have access to these cool things that I can see in Greentown Labs or these jobs that are here, that my kids should have the same access and opportunities to that. So what does that mean? When I came in, we have a mayor's youth jobs program. I said, every kid, every high school kid who wants a job gets a job. You can't say no to them. So it used to be, maybe 70 or 80 or 100. This year we had nearly 250 teens in the program. I met with the teens in 2022 at the high school, and I said, so what do you want? What is it you need? There was a cohort of 10 that worked with the Harvard Design School. and they said, we want teen centers, but we don't want one teen center. We want 15-minute walk teen centers, because the kids, they don't have the luxury of having their parents drive them across the city to go, and even with my high schooler, I don't let her go out, past night. My husband and I have to pick her up, but they wanted 15-minute walk centers so the parents would feel good, and they wanted places to hang out. So in the minimal buildings that we had, we opened up 3 locations where they could hang out. They designed the space as they wanted it. We then worked with a community partner that has a space, teen empowerment, and they have teens there. We had another space in a different part of town. So, we have basically 5 different spaces around town for them. So what do I think is, if we're getting to, I'm trying to interrupt that cycle, and I'm putting the framework in, and the next framework is making sure, yes, we can employ them, but we want to employ them all year, or just get them excited. I always think if it's the middle schoolers, I think to myself, the middle schoolers are like toddlers, except they're sassy and they have ideas. And that is just like wonderful, because they're open to everything, and that's exciting. So the goal is to interrupt whatever pathway, because yes, there is some violence that happens. Yes, there have been some middle schoolers that have been found, having guns. And then we all work on it as a team. It is not only our Health and Human Services Department and our schools and our police department. I always say it, and I truly believe it, because I never think I'm the smartest one in the room. I can always learn that if you have more minds together around that work on it and are invested in, they buy into it. We all have shared purpose. And as you physically see Somerville changing, the ability to make sure that the kids don't feel isolated, and that change is not something that they have access to. I just think that is really depressing. And I don't want them, to be depressed about it.
I think we have time for one brief final question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tom Polton. I'm from New York. A bad day for our mayor today, obviously. But my question is, I think that Mayor Turner mentioned that the effort started after the federal government pulled out of the Paris Agreement and the mayors came together.
Right.
I'm just curious if it's been a bipartisan effort, and how it's been taken by members of the Republican Party, and whether it's a model for other things, or does the polarization that we see at a federal level exist with this effort as well?
I'm really, if you want to see bipartisanship operate at its best, then look at your mayors and like the U.S. Conference of Mayors. On the climate action mayors, Democrats. Rain on the city of Houston. And God did not look down and say, where are the Democrats? Or where? And I had, when we were addressing Harvey, who were beating the heck out of cities, call me up, because we were sending our trucks to go pick up all the debris. And the senator called me and said, I noticed that the city trucks are all around my neighborhood. But I have this gated community. Can you all come and pick up the debris? And I said, Senator, my big trucks can't get into that gated community. So she said, well, can you send the little ones? And I mean, true stories. And I kind of just kind of laughed to myself. And I said, Senator, the little trucks are coming, coming. But with climate mayors, yes, conference of mayors, it's a bipartisan group. When it came to funding on the federal level, coming down to the cities after the coronavirus. And we wanted the funding given directly to the cities. It was a combination of Republican mayors, Republican cities, Democratic mayors, all working together. So when the feds pulled away from the Paris Agreement, we thought that was an opportunity for subnational diplomacy to step in. And we were saying to other countries around the globe that cities are still in. And we worked with other cities in other parts of the world to come on the same page. And that's why when you look at a lot of these climate conferences that are taking place all over, you have a combination of mayors from both parties who go and we stand as one.
I think that's a very hopeful note for us to end on tonight. Mayor Turner, Mayor Ballantyne, thank you so much for your thoughts and insights. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your evening to think about this topic with us. This concludes this portion of the evening's events. We're going to move now to a reception and then to the Alumni Awards of